Undercover boss grabs a quick bite, freezes when the waitress admits she's skipping meals to pay rent. The midday sunlight filtered through the dusty glass window, falling gently like lonely golden silk ribbons adrift in the gray, dreary atmosphere. That twilight noon, the weather wasn't particularly cold, yet it was enough to make one feel weary after a long morning. Michael Carter pulled the brim of his knitted hat lower, gently adjusted the old scarf with frayed edges around his neck, and slowly walked down the familiar narrow street. Today, he wasn't dressed in his usual expensive suit, nor did he step out of a luxurious car. Instead, he came here as a stranger, carrying within him a silent burden that had no name. The Sunrise Diner branch appeared before his eyes, modest and somewhat more melancholic than he remembered. The neon sign flickered dimly, as if it too was exhausted, struggling against the relentless flow of time. The glass door creaked as Michael pushed it open. A scent, both familiar and strange, rushed to greet him, the hurried aroma of weak coffee, mixed with the faint bitterness of burnt bread lingering in the cramped space. The diner was nearly empty, with only a few scattered tables quietly occupied. Even so, the atmosphere inside felt like a tired old machine, still forcing itself to keep turning. The staff moved silently, their footsteps barely audible against the worn-out tiled floor. Standing out amid that weary scene was the fragile figure of a young waitress. She looked so delicate it was almost pitiful, her slender shoulders trembling slightly every time a draft slipped through the doorframe. And yet, she still managed to hold a gentle smile on her lips, a fragile smile, like the faint sunlight filtering through the dusty glass, enough to light the room but not to warm it. Michael chose a secluded seat near the window, quietly observing like any ordinary customer. But deep within his eyes, every small movement in this place was being recorded more vividly than ever before. Today's lunch was supposed to be just a quick meal, but deep down, Michael knew he was about to face something not so easy to swallow. The old wall clock gently echoed with dry, brittle ticks, stretching into the silence like a frozen lake. Outside, the midday sunlight cast pale, cold patches across the cracked, faded tiles. Michael slowly turned the silver spoon in his steaming cup of coffee, his quiet gaze following the fragile figure moving tirelessly across the diner, the young waitress, whose tiny name tag simply read, Emily. She hadn't paused for even a moment. 1 second she was hurriedly wiping down a table in the corner. The next she was rushing to the counter with a tray in hand. Her bare hands were red from the cold, her thin fingers curling repeatedly from exhaustion. And despite it all, she still forced that fragile smile, the kind of smile that felt like lonely sunlight, as if the moment she let it slip, it would shatter into pieces. Only when the crowd thinned did Michael finally call out softly, You look exhausted, dear. What did you have for lunch today? Emily froze for a moment, her smile trembling slightly. She lowered her head, her voice as thin and fragile as mist. I haven't eaten yet, sir. I'm saving the money to pay the rent first. She looked up, her eyes shimmering yet so deep, hiding shadows too heavy to conceal. I'm used to it by now. As long as the kids don't get kicked out of the apartment, that's enough for me. Her voice faded toward the end of the sentence, but every word felt like a sharp thorn piercing straight into Michael's heart. Instinctively, he loosened his grip. The spoon slipped from his fingers and fell into the cup, making a soft clink that somehow echoed harshly through the silent room. The coffee before him, still faintly warm just moments ago, seemed to have turned cold entirely in that very instant. And for the first time in years, Michael felt a chill far colder than winter creeping deep into his chest, a chill named injustice. Michael gently pushed the coffee cup aside, his gaze sweeping across the diner like a fine yet razor-sharp net. And then, the hidden shadows that had long been veiled began to reveal themselves under that piercing, unflinching look. Emily continued moving tirelessly, like a lone bird fighting against the headwinds. She managed the entire diner on her own, her thin legs darting swiftly between the tables as if they barely touched the ground. Every time the order bell chimed, she rushed to the counter, her hands working quickly, trying to hold on to that faint smile, even though her breaths had already turned shallow and ragged. Meanwhile, in a corner behind the partition wall, 2 male employees leaned lazily against the wall, chatting casually about last night's soccer game and their plans for the weekend. They laughed out loud, not even bothering to glance at the tables waiting to be cleaned. Behind the foggy glass of the manager's office, Paul, the man in charge of this branch, was comfortably reclined in a swivel chair, one leg crossed leisurely over the desk. His vacant eyes skimmed through his phone screen while now and then taking a long drag from his vape, the cold blue light blinking faintly in the swirling mist of vapor. Michael narrowed his eyes, feeling a bitter dryness in his throat, more unpleasant than any cold coffee could ever be. He reached for the bill tucked under the clip, unfolded it, and inspected it carefully. His experienced eyes scanned the faded numbers on the thin receipt, and his expression slowly darkened. There was no record whatsoever of the tip he had just left on the table, though he distinctly remembered placing the bill under the saucer himself just moments ago. With practiced ease, Michael pulled out his phone, logged into the POS management system access granted only to the highest executives. Behind the simple interface lay rows of numbers easily overlooked by the average person. But Michael was no average person, and what he was about to uncover was far worse than he had feared. Within just a few minutes, he uncovered the anomalous software update approved 3 weeks ago, authorized directly by Paul. That update didn't improve performance as described. Instead, it cleverly concealed all transactions related to tips from the internal financial reports. The cold, hard numbers appeared clearly. Tips recorded in the system. 0. Actual tips collected at the counter. No reconciliation available. It was a sophisticated scheme, carefully orchestrated under the guise of operational cost balancing. And the victims were people like Emily, those who sold their labor and even their own meals just to hold on to their meager wages. Michael leaned back quietly in his chair, his fingers interlaced, eyes staring distantly through the time-worn, foggy glass. But behind that gaze, a storm had already begun to brew. And this time, it would not remain silent. The atmosphere in the diner seemed to grow heavier, thickened by seemingly trivial things that now pressed down unbearably. Michael glanced at the old wall clock. The minute hand crept along painfully slowly, as if even time itself was struggling under the weight of this moment. From the corner of the counter, the shrill laughter of the 2 male employees rang out, a blatant mockery amidst the sweat-drenched struggle of Emily working tirelessly. That girl works herself to death for nothing. Let's see how much she gets in tips at the end of the month, one of them sneered, his voice blending with the static-filled music from the old radio. Tips? Are you that naive? The other slapped the counter and burst into raucous laughter. Paul scoops it all up, says it's to balance the payroll and cover operational fees. It's perfectly legal, isn't it? Michael clenched his hands tightly, his knuckles turning white, but he didn't make a move just yet. The storm was coming, and it had to hit at exactly the right moment. He shifted his gaze toward the slightly ajar office door. From inside, Paul's voice drifted out, full of smug indifference. Another golf round this afternoon. Once this is all wrapped up, I'm expecting a nice bonus. These employees are idiots. If they had any sense, they'd play the game and grab their own share. Who told them to work like slaves without opening their eyes to smarter ways? A derisive laugh echoed, followed by the cold glow of his vape casting a chilling blue light through the foggy glass, like a blade slicing straight through the listener's heart. Michael took a deep breath, his chest feeling as if it were crushed under a heavy stone. He quietly reached for his phone, activated the recording function, and then discreetly turned on the hidden camera, aiming it directly at the manager's office and the smug employees by the counter. He didn't just want the truth, he needed proof. And this time, no one would have a chance to deny it. It was at that very moment that Michael's eyes caught sight of Emily, standing frozen in the middle of the diner. One hand clenched tightly around a receipt just signed by a customer, the other pressed against her stomach. She lowered her head, biting her lip, silently enduring a sharp, twisting pain that no one seemed to notice. Michael knew exactly what was tormenting her hunger. A young woman, carrying herself with such quiet resilience, was now being pushed to the brink by the very dedication she showed. He gripped the frayed scarf tighter around his neck, his eyes narrowing sharply like a blade. This ends now. And as the gloomy sky outside gathered heavy clouds, Michael knew a real storm was rising inside Sunrise Diner, and he would be the one to set it off. No more silence, no more compromise. This time, justice would be delivered to those who truly deserved it. That morning, the sunlight barely pierced through the thick gray clouds, casting a faint, pale glow over the weathered sign of Sunrise Diner like a quiet warning of the storm about to break. The air inside the diner was stretched tight like a drawn bowstring. One by one, the staff gathered nervously in the main hall, unable to hide the anxiety in their uneasy glances. Then, the overhead PA system crackled to life, a deep, firm voice ringing out, cold and decisive like a final command. All staff and manager Paul report to the main hall, immediately. Just those few words were enough to make the air feel suffocating. The quiet murmurs faded to complete silence as the glass doors swung open and Michael Carter walked in. Gone was the old, worn-out coat from the day before. Today, he stood tall with the commanding presence of a true leader, imposing yet quietly formidable. His sharp, icy gaze swept across every face, lingering longer on the pale and exhausted expression of Emily, who stood silently by the bar, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the counter just to keep herself standing. Paul emerged from the office last, his shirt hastily buttoned, his eyes darting around nervously but still carrying a trace of defiance. Michael didn't waste time with formalities or empty words. He pulled out his phone and connected it directly to the PA system. In an instant, the recorded voices echoed loud and clear across the silent room. Another golf round this afternoon. Once this is all wrapped up, I'm looking at a fat bonus. These employees, too dumb to care, just keep their heads down and grind without ever thinking smart. Tips? Paul's got it all locked up. It's for balancing the payroll perfectly by the book. The sneering laughter, the scornful voices, and even the crack of a beer can opening echoed like resounding slaps, landing hard on the pride of every staff member standing there. And in that moment, no one could look away from the truth any longer. Michael stared directly at Paul, his voice cutting through the silence clear, resolute, each word landing like a hammer strike. Would you like me to play the rest of the recording? The part where you said, just let Emily shed a few tears and she'll obediently work herself to the bone all day? Paul's face turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the chilly morning air. He stammered, We only did that to balance the costs, Mr. Carter. Everyone's struggling these days. Michael let out a faint, icy laugh, a sound so cold, it sent a chill through the room. He stepped slowly toward Paul, his eyes piercing through him like a blade, stripping away every layer of false pretense. Balance the costs? He repeated each word deliberately, his voice dropping low, heavy as a final verdict. You dress impeccably, sit comfortably in a private office, vape imported flavors, drink fine liquor, play golf every weekend while people like Emily have to starve just to save enough for rent and care for her two small children. You enjoy lavish dinners while they get by some days on nothing but a few slices of dry bread. Is that what you call balancing costs? The entire hall fell silent, every breath held tight in strained lungs. No sound dared to rise above the tension. Emily stood motionless, both hands covering her mouth, tears spilling freely down her gaunt cheeks. Michael turned, his gaze sweeping over all those who had endured in silence for so long. His voice rose calm yet powerful, carrying with it a long-forgotten sense of pride awakened. From today, every transaction in this branch will be thoroughly audited. All the tips that were stolen will be returned to those who truly deserve them. And one more thing. He paused, turning his head sharply toward Paul. His eyes, colder than the first winter wind cutting through the fogged windows, locked onto the disgraced manager. You're fired, effective immediately. The storm that had been quietly brewing for days had finally broken, decisive, unrelenting. But what remained after the storm wasn't destruction. It was the beginning of a warm, new dawn after a long, bitter winter. The room now felt oppressively heavy with an almost suffocating silence. The ticking of the clock echoed strangely loud, as if counting down the final moments before a long-awaited sentence was passed. Paul stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the tips of his shoes, his trembling hands fumbling to straighten his shirt, lost in helpless confusion. Under the pale light streaming weakly through the fogged glass window, a bead of sweat rolled down his forehead and fell to the floor with a faint, dry plip, a small sound that echoed like thunder, striking straight at the exposed remains of his shattered dignity. No one uttered a word. No one dared to move from their place. Even the staff who used to gather around gossiping now stood with their heads lowered, avoiding the fiery glare of their boss blazing with righteous anger. Michael took a deep breath, slowly stepping forward once more. Each heavy, resolute footstep echoed through the room, landing like thunder in the hearts of those present, hearts burdened with long days of silent endurance, stolen tip money, restless nights filled with worry, and the gnawing ache of hunger. He took out a thick folder and placed it on the table with a resounding thud. Here, Michael pointed to each bank statement, each printed receipt, each system report from the POS. His voice grew sharp and firm. These are the numbers you call balanced. Balanced on their sweat and tears. And I didn't just find traces of this at this brancher's evidence at least 2 other locations you managed. Paul's head snapped up, his face pale as a sheet. He tried to stammer out a defense, but every word crumbled into nothing like the gasping breaths of a man about to be swept away by the storm of truth. A young employee, Tom, stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mr. Carter, is it really true? Will we finally get back what should have been ours? Michael nodded slowly, his gaze softening, his voice low but unwavering. Not only will you get back what's owed, from today on, Every cent of the tips you rightfully earn will be made public and transparent every single day, and I will personally oversee it. End 1. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the hall. Then, like a spark igniting a flame in the long dark night, a few hesitant claps broke the silence, growing louder, stronger, until the room filled with the sound of heartfelt applause, a wave of release and triumph surging through everyone present. Emily stood quietly behind the counter, her frail arms hugging an old tablecloth tightly to her chest. Her small shoulders trembled, but her tears now fell not from hardship, but from overwhelming relief after months of silent suffering. Michael turned and looked at Paul one last time. "I hope," he said slowly, each word landing heavy as stone, "that the price you pay for your so-called balancing will be far greater than everything you've pocketed. You may leave now. And don't you ever show your face anywhere that bears the name Sunrise Diner again." Paul lowered his head, turned, and walked away in silence, his back to the room filled with contemptuous glares and thunderous applause. The door closed behind him with a final, echoing clang like the sound of a door shutting forever on a life and a chance he would never reclaim. And then, as if by some divine arrangement, the heavy clouds outside gently parted, revealing a rare patch of clear blue sky. Sunlight streamed through every window pane, warming hearts that had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. The storm had passed, and from its ruins, a new spring of hope, of faith, of justice began to bloom, right there in the small kitchen of Sunrise Diner. The next morning, the sky was unusually bright and clear, as if the whole city had just been cleansed after yesterday's storm of the heart. The first rays of sunlight crept through the old glass windows of Sunrise Diner, gently touching each table, every quiet corner, as if awakening the space from a long, cold slumber. The door creaked open, and the wind chimes above tinkled softly like the gentle laughter of spring's first visit. Emily walked in, but today, she was no longer the fragile waitress with slumped shoulders and a thin figure shivering through bitter winter days. A new shining name tag gleamed proudly on her crisp, clean uniform. The small letters read, "Assistant Manager, Emily Saunders." And more special than anything, she didn't come alone today. By her side were her two children. Her little daughter, about 6 years old, clung gently to her mother's hand, the other hand carefully holding a steaming cup of milk. Her round eyes sparkled in the soft morning light. Her younger brother, his chubby cheeks rosy from the cold, kept cupping his tiny hands around his own warm cup, savoring a warmth they hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Michael stood quietly behind the bar, watching this scene unfold with a calm, silent gaze. He didn't step forward. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, silently witnessing that peaceful moment, a living testament that every effort he had made, every storm he had stirred through this place, had all been worth it. The atmosphere inside the diner had changed. It was warmer now, more alive. Emily bent down to gently wipe the milk from her son's lips, then looked up and met Michael's gaze, and she smiled. It was no longer a forced, weary smile. It no longer hid pain. It was a full, radiant smile, sparkling like sunlight dancing on morning dew. Somewhere in the background, the coffee machine hummed its familiar tune, but this time, that sound no longer echoed coldly through a silent, empty room. It became the soundtrack for a new beginning, warm and full of hope. Asterisk, asterisk. Sometimes a simple sandwich and a cup of coffee aren't just a meal to fill the stomach. For someone, it might be an entire day of contentment. For someone, it's a rare moment of peace, a gentle reminder that they still exist in this crowded world. And sometimes, within that humble sandwich, within that simple cup of coffee, lies something more precious than anything else. A look of understanding, an outstretched hand, and a whispered promise that says, "You are not forgotten, and tomorrow will be better." Asterisk, asterisk,